Hello, welcome to Midweek. My name is John. I'm pastor here at Bayside Baptist. Midweek's a time when we get together to discuss and discover God's Word. Normally I have a friend with me to discuss the passage with, but tonight we are preparing to jump back into 1 Samuel. On July 18th, we will jump into 1 Samuel chapter 16. The life of David. We covered the first 15 chapters about 5 or 6 years ago in 2015. And so we want to kind of help you be ready to hear from God from the life of David, starting in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And anytime we discuss and discover God's Word together, a key principle to keep in mind is context. That context is king. The context determines the meaning of the passage, the application of the story that you're reading. And we have to understand the context to see how the original audience understood the text. Sometimes we forget the Bible was written to people thousands of years ago before it was written to us. And whatever it means for us, you know, it has to be rooted in what it meant for them. And so we must understand the context in order to see the original audience, how the original audience understood the text. And so when we come to God's Word, you know, it's tempting for us to sit around and ask, well, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for me? And when we do, we rip it out of its context and we risk we risk missing the point or even getting the text wrong, because before I ask what it means for me, I need to ask, what does it say? What did it mean? How is it constructed? How does it fit together? Is it a story? Is it a letter? Is it a poem? And all of this helps me move towards that question, what is God saying to me? What is God saying to us today in the 21st century? And so by understanding the text, the story in its context, how it would have been understood to the original audience, in the original writing, we're better prepared to understand what God is saying to us today and to apply God's Word and God's wisdom to our lives today. Now, in particular, we want to consider 3 levels of context when we read the Bible. There's a literary context. That's the flow of the story or the flow of the letter, the argument. And we look at the larger section in which our passage resides. So we are picking up with 1 Samuel chapter 16. So what happened in chapters 1 through 15? Particularly what happened in chapter 15. We're going to link tonight to a video from the Bible Project that gives you the big picture of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, that'll help you better understand the flow of the story and where we're at. That when we get to David, we see David in connection to Saul. We see David and Saul in connection to Samuel. In fact, we see Samuel, Saul, and David in connection to the book of Judges. And it starts to help us get a better understanding of what God is showing us through the life of David. So there's the literary context where our chapter or our story fits into the larger book and even into the larger book of the Bible we'll get to in a second. There's also the historical context. What were the circumstances or the situation of the original audience? And to figure this out, we don't need to go study ancient Near Eastern history and know a lot about the history of the people behind the text. What we're really doing there is we want to read 1 Samuel over and over and over. In fact, because 1st and Samuel were written together, we want to read 1st and 2nd Samuel together, listening to what we learn from the story about the original audience. Now, we're going to come back to this in a minute because part of tonight is to help you understand the historical context of 1 Samuel. So there's the literary context, there's the historical context, there's also the biblical context. And this is not just how does, for example, chapter 16 fit into 1 Samuel, but how does 1 Samuel fit into the Old Testament? How does 1 Samuel fit into the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation? And one way we can get a better understanding of this is looking for how the author cites or alludes to other biblical passages that he and his audience would have known. And we'll see some of this biblical context tonight as we talk about the historical context. A lot of times there's overlap here. And another kind of illustration of the biblical context is last week we talked about the theme of the Messiah and how it leads to Jesus and the gospel. And so this theme of the Messiah helps us to understand how 1 Samuel fits into the larger story that the Bible's telling, starting in Genesis 3:15 with God's promise to send an offspring of the woman to crush the serpent, but moving all the way through Genesis 49, Numbers 24, 2 Samuel chapter 7, as that promise starts to focus on not just a son, but a king who would rule God's kingdom, would rule the nations, who would have an eternal kingdom by the time we get to Daniel chapter 7. And so understanding that theme helps us see how the story, the life of David, fits into the bigger story that the Bible's telling. So the key question for every story or every chapter or even every paragraph, if you're in like one of Paul's letters, we want to ask, why has the author put this passage here at this place in the book, in the Bible? The context, it means we have to read. We have to read and reread and listen to the text as well as the whole Bible. This is one reason why it's great to have the habit of reading the Bible through in a year or every 2 years. It's because you're constantly reading, getting an idea of the bigger picture of the Bible. And that's not something that comes from reading the Bible once or twice. It comes from a lifetime of reading and rereading the Bible. And each time you read, you'll get you'll get another piece or two of the bigger picture. Your knowledge of God and Christ will continue to expand. So we're talking about context tonight. I want to talk about the historical context of 1 Samuel. Samuel did not write 1 and 2 Samuel. He's front and center in chapters 1 through 8 or so. He pretty much disappears after chapter 16, and he dies in chapter 25. And so there's still 6 chapters of 1 Samuel and all of 2 Samuel that hasn't happened yet. That's why Samuel didn't write this, or at least he didn't write all of it. Maybe he wrote some of the first chapters. We don't really know. But the prophet Samuel, don't think because it's called Samuel, he sat down and wrote all of this. Most of Samuel, and I'm talking about 1 Samuel as one book, was written after he died. But the prophet Samuel is incredibly important to the whole book that's named after him. So even though it was written years after his death, he is key. He's kind of front and center even after he dies to understanding what's going on here. And so from that, we can gather from the book itself, the original readers of the book of Samuel lived during a time of great discouragement, probably even exile and captivity. They lived in a time of disobedience to God's covenant. Their disobedience had come primarily because their leaders, the prophets, priests, and kings, had led them in the ways of the nations around them and not in the ways of the Lord. We see this situation or a situation like this in Jeremiah, the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, chapter 8. So God had warned the people by sending his prophets, but the nation would not listen. Instead, they followed the word of the false prophets and weak kings. Again, we can see this situation or a situation like this in the Old Testament book of 2 Kings, about halfway through chapter 17. And so this shows us how the problem of the exile was a crisis in godly leadership. Israel had not understood the role of their leaders, the prophets, the kings, and many of these leaders themselves did not understand their roles, God's purpose for their calling among the people of Israel. So in the book of Samuel, the author uses the prophet Samuel as a lesson in godly leadership. Samuel demonstrates by his actions the proper role of God's prophet as a leader of God's people. We can see a reflection of this in Psalm 99. Psalm 99, verse 6, Samuel is held up along with Moses and Aaron as a model of the kind of leader God desires for his people. And this kind of prophetic leadership was exhibited by Samuel throughout this book. And this is the leadership that had been taught in the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18. If we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 18, what we see is God says to the people of Israel, when you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. And God talks about don't practice divination, don't tell fortunes, don't interpret omens and practice sorcery, don't cast spells, don't consult a medium or spiritualist or inquire of the dead. And God goes on to say in verse 14 of Deuteronomy 18, though these nations you're about to drive out listen to fortune tellers and diviners, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do this. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, this is Moses speaking, from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. This is what you requested from the Lord your God at Mount Oreb, and that's Mount Sinai, on the day of the assembly when you said, let us not continue to hear the voice of the Lord our God to see this great fire any longer, so that we will not die. Then the Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command. I will hold accountable whoever does not listen to my words that he speaks in my name. But the prophet who presumes to speak a message in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet must die. You may say to yourself, how can we recognize a message the Lord has not spoken? Well, when a prophet speaks in the Lord's name, and the message does not come true or is not fulfilled, that is the message the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him. So this message can be summarized in 4 points. Israel was to have access to the Word of God in a way quite different from the other nations. God fundamentally rejected the ways of the nations, that is, divination, sorcery, witchcraft, the calling upon the dead. Second, the way Israel was to hear the word of God was limited to the word of the prophet. And of course, we have the words of the prophets written down, that is, our Old Testament. So God was to give Israel an institution of prophets who were to speak his words to his people. Israel had requested this kind of word from God at Mount Sinai because they were afraid to speak with God face to face. And so God's going to speak through his prophets to his people. And the prophet's word was to have absolute authority as God's word to the people. When the prophet speaks, it is God speaking through the prophet. So God is speaking through Isaiah. God is speaking through Jeremiah. God is speaking through Moses. God is speaking through David and the Psalms that David wrote. This is the way that God has chosen to speak to his people. And then fourth, the people were to be on constant guard against wrongly following the word of false prophets. They were to test their prophets to see if the word they spoke proved true over the course of time. A true prophet was one whose words about the future were fulfilled. So Samuel, the prophet, is important because he exemplifies the true prophet. He's not perfect, we know this from the story, but he does exemplify the qualities of the prophet who speaks God's word to God's people. And the lives of Saul and David can contrast a king who refused to listen to, trust, and obey God's word given through the prophet, and a king who is willing to listen to, trust, and obey God's word given to the prophet. So both Samuel and David point forward to, they are not perfect, but their hearts, in their heart, they show what a true prophet and a true king look like, and they point forward to the true and better prophet and king, Christ Jesus. The two Bible Project videos on 1st and 2nd Samuel will help you see how their stories point forward to Jesus. And so I hope that you'll take time to watch those as they're linked to this video and get a better understanding of the big picture of what God is doing in the book of Samuel to point us to the kind of person, whether a prophet or a king, a follower of Jesus that God is looking for. That's a person who will listen to, trust, and obey God. Let's pray. Father, give us wisdom as we study your word together. Use the book of 1 Samuel to challenge us as a church to grow our knowledge of Christ, our faith in Christ, our character as we conform it to Christ, and our actions as we pattern them after Christ. In your holy name I pray. Amen.
The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. They're two separate books in our modern Bibles, but that division is due simply to scroll length. It was originally written as one coherent story. We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came into the Promised Land. And there, Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey the covenant commands. Before the book of Samuel, Judges showed how Israel failed at that task big time. It was a period of moral chaos, and it showed Israel's need for wise, faithful leaders. The book of Samuel provides an answer to that need. The book of Samuel's story focuses on three main characters: the prophet Samuel, where the book gets its name, and then King Saul, and after that, King David. And all three of them transitioned Israel from a group of tribes ruled by judges into a unified kingdom ruled by King David in Jerusalem. And the book of Samuel has a fascinating design that weaves the story of these three characters together in four main parts. Samuel, he's the key leader and prophet in the first section of the book, but then he also plays a key role in the next section, which is Saul's story, and it's told in two movements: Saul's rise to power and then his failures. And the second part is about his downfall and his tragic death. And then the drama of Saul's demise is matched by David's exciting rise to power. And then David's story is told in two movements. First, he rides the wave of his success, followed by his own tragic failure and the slow self-destruction of his family and then his kingdom. The book concludes with an epilogue that reflects back over the whole story. So let's dive in and see how this all unfolds. Part 1 picks up from the chaos of the book of Judges, and we're introduced to a touching story about a woman named Hannah. And she's grieved because she has never been able to have children. And by God's grace, she finally has a son named Samuel. And in joy, she sings this amazing poem in chapter 2. And the poem is all about how God opposes the proud and exalts the humble, about how despite tragedies and human evil, God is working out his purposes in history. And also it's about how God will one day raise up an anointed king for his people. Now, Hannah's poem has been placed here at the beginning of the book to introduce these key themes that we're going to see throughout the whole story, like the next one. Samuel grows up and becomes a great prophet and leader for the people of Israel, at the same time that the Philistines rise to power as Israel's arch nemesis. And in this crucial battle, the Israelites get arrogant, and instead of praying and asking God for help, they trot out the Ark of the Covenant as this kind of magic trophy that will automatically grant them victory in battle. And so because of their arrogant presumption, God allows Israel to lose the battle and the ark is stolen. So the Philistines, they take the ark and they place it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And then the God of Israel defeats the Philistines and the god Dagon without an army by sending plagues on the people. And then the Philistines don't want the ark anymore, obviously, and they send it back to Israel. And the point of this little story seems to be this: God is not Israel's trophy, and he opposes pride among the Philistines, but also among his own people. And so Israel needs to remain humble and obedient if they want to experience God's covenant blessing, which opens up into the next large section. The Israelites come to Samuel and they say, hey, we want a king like all the other nations have. Go find one for us. And so Samuel, he's kind of ticked off and he goes to consult with God. And God says, yes, their motives are all wrong, but if a king is what they want, give them one. And so we're introduced to the figure of Saul. Now, Saul is a tragic figure because he begins full of promise. He's tall, he's good looking, he's a perfect candidate for a king, but he has deep character flaws. He's dishonest, he lacks integrity, and he seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes. And so these flaws become his downfall. He wins some battles at the beginning, but his flaws run so deep, he eventually disqualifies himself by blatantly disobeying God's commands. And so the aging Samuel confronts Saul and Israel. He had warned the people that they would only benefit from a king who's humble and faithful to God. Otherwise, the kings of Israel will bring ruin. So he informs Saul that God is going to raise up a new king to replace him. And so Saul's downfall begins, as God at the same time is working behind the scenes to raise up that new king. It's an insignificant shepherd boy named David. He's the least likely candidate to be king, but the famous story of David and Goliath shows that God's choice of David is not based on his family status, but simply on his radical and humble trust in the God of Israel. And so this story embodies all of the themes of Hannah's poem. Proud Saul and Goliath are brought low, while humble David is exalted. From here, we watch Saul slowly descend into madness, while David rises to power. So David starts working for Saul as a general, and he's winning all of the battles, and he's also winning all of the fame. And so Saul gets jealous, and he starts chasing David around, hunting him, trying to kill him. David's done nothing wrong, and so David simply runs and waits in the wilderness. And here we see David's true character. He has multiple opportunities to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God will raise up a king for his people. What's interesting, too, is that many of the poems of David that you find in the book of Psalms are linked to this very period of his life, and they all express the same attitude of trust. And so this section of the book ends with Saul coming to a grisly death after losing a battle with the Philistines. 1 Samuel tells some of the most intricate, well-told stories you find anywhere in the Bible, and the characters Saul and David, they're portrayed very realistically. And the author's putting them forward as character studies so that you can find yourself in them. So in Saul's story, we see a warning. It's crucial that we reflect on our own character flaws and how they harm us and other people. And with God's help, we need to humble ourselves and deal with our dark side so that Saul's story doesn't become ours. David, on the other hand, is presented as an example of patience and trust in God's timing in our lives. And so he's running in the wilderness, being chased by Saul. David had every reason to think that God had abandoned him, but that's not what he thinks. And so David's story encourages us to trust that despite human evil, God is working out his purposes to oppose the proud and to exalt the humble. And that's what 1 Samuel is all about. The book of 2 Samuel. Check out the video on 1 Samuel where we were introduced to the book's three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David, and then also to the book's literary design, which first introduced Samuel and then traced the rise and fall of King Saul in contrast to the rise of King David. 2 Samuel tells the story of David as Israel's king, and in two movements. There's a season of success and a blessing, followed by a huge moral failure and then its sad consequences. And then the book ends with this well-crafted conclusion that reflects back on the good and the bad in David's life, generating hope for a future king to come from his line. So 2 Samuel picks up after Saul's death, and David surprises everyone by composing this long poem where he laments the death of the very man who tried to murder him. And so once again, the author, he's presenting David's humility and compassion. He's a man who grieves the death even of his own enemies. After this, David experiences a season of success and God's blessing. All of the Israelite tribes, they come to David and then they ask him to unify all the tribes as their king. And so the first thing David does as king is to go to the city of Jerusalem. He conquers it, and he establishes it as Israel's capital city, which he renames as Zion. And from there, David goes on and he wins many battles and expands Israel's territory. Now, after making Jerusalem the political capital of Israel, he wants to make it their religious capital as well. And so he has the Ark of the Covenant moved into the city. And then in 2 Samuel 7, he tells God, now that Israel has a permanent home, he thinks that God's presence should also get a permanent house. So he asks if he can build a temple for the God of Israel. But God says to David, thank you for that thought, but actually I'm going to build you a house, a dynasty. Now, 2 Samuel 7, this is a key chapter for understanding the storyline of the whole Bible, because God here makes a promise to David that from his royal line will come a future king who's going to build God's temple here on earth and set up an eternal kingdom. And it's this messianic promise to David that gets picked up and developed more in the book of Psalms and also in the books of the prophets. And it's this king that gets connected to God's promise to Abraham. The future messianic kingdom will be how God brings his blessing to all of the nations. And it's right here, in the midst of all this divine blessing, that things go horribly wrong. David makes a fatal mistake. Not fatal for him, but for a man named Uriah, one of David's prize soldiers. So from his rooftop, David sees Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, bathing. David finds her, he sleeps with her, gets her pregnant, and then he tries to cover the whole thing up by having Uriah assassinated and then marrying her. It's just horrible. So when David's confronted by the prophet Nathan about all of this, he immediately owns up to what he's done. He's broken, he repents, he asks God to forgive him, and God does forgive him, but God doesn't erase the consequences of David's decisions. And so as a result of this horrible choice, David's family, his kingdom, it all falls apart. And it makes this section a tragic story, much like Saul's downfall. So David's sons end up repeating his own mistakes, but in even more tragic ways. So Amnon sexually abuses his sister Tamar, and then their brother Absalom finds out about all of this and has Amnon assassinated. And then Absalom goes and he hatches the secret plan to oust his father David from power, and he launches this full-scale rebellion. And so for a second time, David is forced to flee from his own home and go hide in the wilderness, except this time he is not an innocent man. The rebellion ends when David's son is murdered, when it breaks David's heart. And so once again, he laments over the very man who tried to kill him. David's last days find him back on his throne, but as a broken man, he's wounded by the sad consequences of his sin. The book concludes with a well-crafted epilogue, with stories that are out of chronological order, but they have this really cool symmetrical literary design. So the outer pair of stories come from earlier in David's reign, and they compare the failures of Saul and then of David, and how each of them hurt other people through their bad decisions. The next inner pair of stories are about David and his band of mighty men who went about fighting the Philistines. And what's interesting is that both sections have a story of David's weakness in battle. So in contrast to the victorious David of chapters 1 through 9, here we see a vulnerable David who's dependent on others for help. The center of the epilogue has two poems that act like memoirs, and David reflects back on his life. And he remembers times when God graciously rescued him from danger. And he sees these as moments where God was faithful to his covenant promise to him and to his family. Both poems conclude by looking back onto the hope of God's promise of a future king who will build that eternal kingdom. Now these poems and then God's promise also connect back to Hannah's poem that opened the book. And so these key passages from the beginning, now the middle, and the end of the book bring the book's themes all together. Despite Saul and David's evil, God remained at work, moving forward his redemptive purposes. And God opposed David and Saul's arrogance, but he exalted David when he humbled himself. And so the future hope of this book reaches far beyond David himself. It looks to the future, to the Messianic King who will one day bring God's kingdom and blessing to all of the nations. And that's what the book of Samuel is all about.